Mosby's War Reminiscences. Chapter 1. Rebellion. How many a spirit born to bless hath sunk beneath that withering name, whom but a day's and hour's success had wafted to eternal fame. Tom Moore. In April 1861, I was attending court at Abingdon, Virginia, when I met a person who had just stepped out of the telegraph office, who informed me that tremendous tidings were passing over the wires. Going in, I inquired of the operator what it was, who told me that Lincoln had issued a proclamation calling out troops. Fort Sumter had fallen 2 days before. The public mind was already strained to a high pitch of excitement, and it required only a spark to produce an explosion. The indignation aroused by the President's proclamation spread like fire on a prairie, and the laws became silent in the midst of arms. People of every age, sex, and condition were borne away on the tide of excited feeling that swept over the land. The home of Gov. John B. Floyd, who had resigned as Secretary of War under Buchanan, was at Abingdon. I went to his house and told him the news. He immediately issued a call to arms, which resounded like the roll of Ziska's drum among the mountains of southwestern Virginia. Many of the most influential families in that region were descendants of the men who had fought under Morgan and Campbell at Eutaw Springs and Kings Mountain. Their military spirit was inflamed by stirring appeals to the memories of the deeds their sires had done. Women, too, came forward to inspire men with a spirit of heroic self-sacrifice, and a devotion that rivaled the maidens of Carthage and Saragossa, all the pride and affection that Virginians had felt in the traditions of the government which their ancestors had made, and the great inheritance which they had bequeathed, were lost in the overpowering sentiment of sympathy with the people who were threatened with invasion. It is a mistake to suppose that the Virginia people went to war in obedience to any decree of their state commanding them to go. On the contrary, the people were in a state of armed revolution before the state had acted in its corporate capacity. I went along with the flood like everybody else. A few individuals here and there attempted to breast the storm of passion, and appeared like Virgil's shipwrecked mariners, Rarimontes and Sergid Vasto. Their fate did not encourage others to follow their example, and all that they did was to serve like ocean wrecks to illuminate the storm. In anticipation of these events, a cavalry company had for some months been in process of organization, which I had joined as a private. This company, known as the Washington Mounted Rifles, was immediately called together by its commanding officer, Captain William E. Jones. Captain Jones was a graduate of West Point and had resigned some years before from the United States Army. He was a stern disciplinarian and devoted to duty. Under a rugged manner and impracticable temper, he had a heart that beat with warm impulses. To his inferiors in rank he was just and kind, but too much inclined to cross the wishes and criticize the orders of his superiors. He had been a classmate of Stonewall Jackson at the military academy, and related to me many anecdotes of Jackson's piety, as well as his eccentricities. He was a hard swearer, and a few days after the Battle of Bull Run he told me that he was at Jackson's headquarters, and Jackson got very much provoked at something a soldier had done. When Jones said, "Jackson, let me cuss him for you," he fell in battle with General Hunter in the Valley of Virginia in June 1864. We went into barracks at Abingdon and began drilling. No service I ever had to perform during the war went as much against the grain as standing guard the first night I was in camp. I had no friends in the cavalry company, so I applied to Gov. Litchin for a transfer to an infantry company that had been raised in that part of the county where I resided. But on the very day I made the application, a telegraphic order came for us to start for Richmond immediately, and I never heard anything more of it. My company marched on horseback all the way to Richmond, about 500 miles, while the infantry company went by rail. But how small is the control that mortals have over their own destinies. The company to which I unsuccessfully applied to be transferred became a part of the immortal division of Stonewall Jackson, in which I would have had only a slight chance of asserting my individuality, which would have been merged in the mass. I remember distinctly now how, with a heart almost bursting with grief, in the midst of a rain, I bade my friends in the infantry company farewell just as they were about getting on the train. I had no dream then that I would ever be anything more than a private soldier. On the same day, in rain and mud, we started on the march to Richmond. A few days before, a flag had been presented to our company by a young lady, with an address in which she reminded us that the coward dies 1,000 deaths, the brave man dies but one. I am sure there was not a man among us who did not feel the ambition of the youth in Longfellow's poem bearing Onward amid the ice and snow of Alpine heights his banner with its strange device. The march to Richmond under a soldier who had bivouacked on the plains was a course of beneficial discipline. The grief of parting from home and friends soon wore away, and we all were as gay as if we were going to a wedding or a picnic. Gloom was succeeded by mirth and songs of gladness, and if Abraham Lincoln could have been sung out of the South as James II was out of England, our company would have done it and saved the country all the fighting. The favorite songs were generally those of sentiment and sadness, intermingled with an occasional comic melody. I remember this refrain of one that often resounded from the head to the rear of the column as we passed some farmer's house. He who has good buttermilk a-plenty, and gives the soldiers none, he shan't have any of our buttermilk when his buttermilk is gone. The buttermilk, as well as everything else that the farmer had that was good, was generally given to the soldiers. The country was brimful of patriotism. The gaiety with which men marched into the face of death is not so remarkable as the fortitude and cheerfulness of the wives and mothers who stayed at home and waited for the news of the battles. In nearly every home of the South could be found an example of that Spartan mother who sent her son to the wars with her last injunction, to return with his shield or return upon it. This courage, exhibited in the beginning, survived to the last, through all the long agony and bloody sweat of the struggle. On reaching Richmond, after a few days' rest, we were ordered to the Shenandoah Valley. A day or so before we started, Captain Jones made a requisition on the quartermaster's department for clothing for his company. We were furnished with suits of a very rough quality of goods manufactured in the Virginia penitentiary. It almost produced a mutiny in the camp. The men piled the clothes up in front of the captain's tent. Only 2 refused to wear them, Private Fountain Beatty and myself. I do not think any clothes I ever wore did me more service than these. When I became a commander, I made Beatty a lieutenant. I think we were both as contented on the picket line, dressed in our penitentiary suits, as we ever were in the gay uniforms we afterwards wore. Our march from Richmond to the Shenandoah Valley was an ovation. Our people had had no experiences of the misery and desolation that follow in the track of war. They were full of its romance and expected us to win battles that would rival the glories of Wagram and Marengo. They never counted the cost of victory. Our company was incorporated into the 1 Regiment of Virginia Cavalry, commanded by Colonel J.E.B. Stewart. It was stationed at a village called Bunker Hill, on the turnpike leading from Winchester to Martinsburg, and was observing the Union Army under Patterson, which was then stationed at the latter place, on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. General Joseph E. Johnston then had his headquarters at Winchester. I first saw Stewart at Bunker Hill. He had then lately resigned from the United States Army to link his fortunes with the Southern Confederacy. He was just 28 years of age, 1 year older than myself, strongly built, with blue eyes, ruddy complexion, and a reddish beard. He wore a blouse and foraging cap with a linen cover called a havelock, as a protection against the sun. His personal appearance indicated the distinguishing traits of his character: dash, great strength of will, and indomitable energy. Stewart soon showed that he possessed all the qualities of a great leader of cavalry: a sound judgment, a quick intelligence to penetrate the designs of an enemy, mingled with the brilliant courage of Rupert. There was then such a wide chasm between me and him that I was only permitted to view him at a distance, and had no thought of ever rising to intimacy with him. He took us the next day on a scout down toward Martinsburg, and gave us our first lesson in war in sight of the enemy. We saw the hills around the town covered with the white tents of the Union Army, and caught 2 soldiers who had ventured too far outside the picket lines. Since then I have witnessed the capture of thousands, but have never felt the same joy as I did over these first 2 prisoners. A few days after this, Patterson started out on a promenade toward Winchester, and then turned squarely off and went back toward Charlestown. Patterson made a good deal of noise with the shells that he threw at us, but nobody was hurt. Stewart kept close on his flanks, both to watch his movements and to screen Johnston's, who had just begun to move to join Beauregard at Manassas. Fitz-John Porter and George H. Thomas, who afterward became distinguished generals, were on his staff. Patterson has been greatly censured for not pressing Johnston and detaining him in the Shenandoah Valley, instead of making the retrograde movement to Charlestown that permitted his escape. He alleges that he acted under the advice of his staff officers. Patterson was a conspicuous figure, as well as failure in the first scene of the first act of the drama of war. After that he disappeared forever. His campaign in the Shenandoah Valley was a mere prologue to the great tragedy that was afterward acted there, Stuart left him in a position where he could neither be of advantage to the cause he upheld nor injury to that he opposed, and crossed the Blue Ridge to take part in the Battle of Bull Run. On the 21st of July, Chapter 2. O shadow of glory, dim image of war, the chase hath no story, her hero no star. Byron, deformed, transformed. After the first battle of Bull Run, Stuart's cavalry was engaged in performing outpost duty on our front, which extended from the falls above Washington to Occoquan. On the lower Potomac, there were no opportunities for adventurous enterprise. McClellan's army was almost in a state of siege in Washington, and his cavalry but rarely showed themselves outside his infantry picket line. We had to go on picket duty 3 times a week and remain 24 hours. The work was pretty hard, but still, soldiers liked it better than the irksome life of the camp. I have often sat alone on my horse from midnight to daybreak, keeping watch over the sleeping army. During this period of inaction, the stereotyped message sent every night from Washington to the Northern press was, "All quiet along the Potomac." While I was a private in Stuart's cavalry, I never missed but one tour of outpost duty, and then I was confined in the hospital from an injury. With one other, I was stationed at the post on the road leading from Falls Church to Lewinsville in Fairfax. At night we relieved each other alternately, one sleeping while the other watched. About dusk, Captain Jones had ridden to the post and instructed us that we had no troops outside our lines on that road, and that we must fire without halting on any body of men approaching from that direction, as they would be the enemy. The night was dark, and it had come my turn to sleep. I was lying on the ground with the soft side of a stone for a pillow, when I was suddenly aroused by my companion, who called to me to mount, that the Yankees were coming. In an almost unconscious state I leaped into my saddle, and at the same instant threw forward my carbine, and both of us fired on a body of cavalry not 50 yards distant. Fortunately, we fired so low our bullets struck the ground just in front of them. The flash from my carbine in my horse's face frightened him terribly. He wheeled, and that is the last I remember about that night. The next thing I recollect is that sometime during the next day I became conscious, and found myself lying on a bed at the house of the keeper of the toll gate. Captain Jones and several of the men of my company were standing by me. It appears that the night before Stuart had sent a company of cavalry to Lewinsville for some purpose. This company had gone out by one road and returned on the one where I had been posted. My horse had run away and fallen over a cow that was lying down and rolled over me. The company of cavalry coming along the same way, their horses in front started and snorted at something lying in the road. They halted, some of them dismounted to see what it was, and discovered me there in an insensible state. They picked me up and carried me into the village, apparently dying. I was bruised from head to foot, and felt like every bone in my body had been broken. I had to be carried to Fairbay Courthouse in an ambulance. There is a tradition that when Captain Jones looked on me that night, he swore harder than the army in Flanders. The feelings he expressed for the officer in fault were not so benevolent as my Uncle Toby's for the fly. While the cavalry did not have an opportunity to do much fighting during the first year of the war, they learned to perform the duties and endure the privations of a soldier's life. My experience in this school was of great advantage to me in the after years when I became a commander. There was a thirst for adventure among the men in the cavalry, and a positive pleasure to get an occasional shot from a rifleman hid in a thicket. There were often false alarms, and sometimes real ones, from scouting parties of infantry who would come up at night to surprise our pickets. A vivid imagination united with a nervous temperament can see in the dark the shapes of many things that have no real existence. A rabbit making its nocturnal rounds, a cow grazing, a hog rooting for acorns, an owl hooting, or the screech of a nighthawk could often arouse and sometimes stampede an outpost or draw the fire of a whole line of pickets. At the first shot the reserve would mount, and soon the vedettes would come running in at full speed. There was an old gray horse roaming about the fields at Fairfax Court House during the first winter of the war that must have been fired at 100 times at night by our vedettes, and yet was never touched. I have never heard whether Congress has voted him a pension. The last time that I was ever on picket was in February 1862. The snow was deep and hard frozen. My post was on the outskirts of Fairfax Court House, at the junction of the Washington Road and Turnpike. I wore a woolen hood to keep my ears from freezing, and a blanket thrown around me as a protection against the cold wind. The night was clear, and all that's best of dark and bright. I sat on my horse under the shadow of a tree, both as a protection from the piercing blast and as a screen from the sight of an enemy. I had gone on duty at midnight to remain until daybreak. The deep silence was occasionally broken by the cry of halt from some distant sentinel as he challenged the patrol or relief. The swaying branches of the trees in the moonlight cast all sorts of fantastic forms on the crystal snow. In this deep solitude I was watching for danger and communing with the spirit of the past. At this very spot, a few nights before, the vedette had been fired on by a scouting party of infantry that had come up from McClellan's camps below, but the old gray horse had several times got up a panic there, which raised a laugh on the soldiers. Now I confess that I was about as much afraid of ridicule as of being shot, and so, unless I got killed or captured, I resolved to spend the night there. Horatius Cocles was not more determined to hold his position on the bridge of the Tiber than I was to stay at my post, but perhaps his motives were less mixed than mine. I had been long pondering and remembering, and in my reverie had visited the fields that I had traversed in life's morning march when my bosom was young. I was suddenly aroused by the crash of footsteps breaking the crust of the hard snow. The sound appeared to proceed from something approaching me with the measured tread of a file of soldiers. It was screened from my view by some houses near the roadside. I was sure that it was an enemy creeping up to get a shot at me, for I thought that even the old horse would not have ventured out on such a night, unless under orders. My heart began to sicken within me pretty much like Hector's did when he had to face the wrath of Achilles. My horse, shivering with cold, with the instinct of danger, pricked up his ears and listened as eagerly as I did to the footsteps as they got near. I drew my pistol, cocked it, and took aim at the corner around which this object must come. I wanted to get the advantage of the first shot. Just then the hero of 100 panics appeared, the old gray horse. I returned my pistol to my belt and relapsed into reverie. I was happy. My credit as a soldier had been saved. A couple of days after this, my company returned there, as usual, on picket. On this same morning, Stuart came, making an inspection of the outposts. It happened that there were 2 young ladies living at Fairfax Courthouse, acquaintances of his, who did not like to stay in such an exposed situation, and so Stuart had arranged to send them to the house of a friend near Frying Pan, which was further within our lines. At that time, the possibility of our army ever retiring to Richmond had not been conceived by the rank and file. Stuart had then become a brigadier general, and Captain Jones had been promoted to be colonel of the One-Stone Virginia Cavalry. Although I served under Stuart almost from the beginning of the war, I had no personal acquaintance with him before then. He asked Captain Blackford to detail a man to go along as an escort for the 2 ladies. I had often been invited to the house of one of them by her father, so I was selected on that account to go with them. I left my horse with my friend Beatty to lead back to camp, and took a seat in the carriage with the ladies. This was on the February 12th, 1862. It began snowing just as we started, and it was late in the afternoon before we got to Frying Pan. I then went in the carriage to Stuart's headquarters a few miles off, at Centerville. It was dark when I got there. I reported to him the result of my mission to Frying Pan, and asked for a pass to go back to the camp of my regiment, which was about 4 miles off on Bull Run. Stuart told me that the weather was too bad for me to walk to camp that night, but to stay where I was until next morning. He and Generals Joseph E. Johnston and G.W. Smith occupied the Grigsby house and messed together. I sat down by a big wood fire in an open fireplace in the front room, where he and the other 2 generals were also sitting. I never spoke a word, and would have been far happier trudging through the snow back to camp, or even as a vedette on a picket post. I felt just as much out of place and uneasy as a mortal would who had been lifted to a seat by the side of the gods on Olympus. Presently supper was announced. The generals all walked into the adjoining room, and Stuart told me to come in. After they had sat down at the table, Stuart observed that I was not there and sent for me. I was still sitting by the fire. I obeyed his summons like a good soldier and took my place among the dilmajores. I was pretty hungry but did not enjoy my supper. I would have preferred fasting or eating with the couriers. I know I never spoke a word to anyone. I don't think I raised my eyes from off my plate while I was at the table. Now, while I felt so much oppressed by the presence of men of such high rank, there was nothing in their deportment that produced it. It was the same way the next morning. Stuart had to send after me to come in to breakfast. I went pretty much in the same dutiful spirit that Gibbon says that he broke his marriage engagement. I sighed as a lover and obeyed as a son, but now my courage rose. I actually got into conversation with Joe Johnston, whom I would have regarded it as a great privilege the day before to view through a long-range telescope. The generals talked of Judah P. Benjamins, who was then Secretary of War, breach of courtesy to Stonewall Jackson that had caused Jackson to send in his resignation. They were all on Jackson's side. There was nothing going on about Centerville to indicate the evacuation that took place 3 weeks after that. Stuart let me have a horse to ride back to camp. As soon as I got there, Colonel Jones sent for me to come to his tent. I went, and he offered me the place of adjutant of the regiment. I had had no more expectation of such a thing than of being translated on Elijah's chariot to the skies. Of course, I accepted it. I was never half as much frightened in any fight I was in as I was on the first dress parade I conducted, but I was not permitted to hold the position long. About 2 months after that, when we had marched to meet McClellan at Yorktown, my regiment reorganized under the new act of the Confederate Congress. Fitz Lee was elected colonel in place of Jones. This was the result of an attempt to mix democracy with military discipline. Fitz Lee did not reappoint me as adjutant, and so I lost my first commission on the spot where Cornwallis lost his sword. This was at the time an unrecognized favor. If I had been retained as adjutant, I would probably have never been anything else. So at the close of the first year of the war, I was, in point of rank, just where I had begun. Well, it did not break my heart. When the army was retiring from Centerville, Stuart's cavalry was the rear guard, and I had attracted his favorable notice by several expeditions I had led to the rear of the enemy, so Stuart told me to come to his headquarters and act as a scout for him. A scout is not a spy who goes in disguise, but a soldier in arms and uniform, who goes among his enemy's lines to get information about them. Among the survivors of the Army of the Potomac there are many legends afloat, and religiously believed to be true, of a mysterious person, a sort of Flying Dutchman or wandering Jew, prowling among their camps in the daytime in the garb of a beggar or with a pilgrim's staff, and leading cavalry raids upon them at night. In popular imagination I have been identified with that mythical character. On the day after Mr. Lincoln's assassination, Secretary Stanton telegraphed to General Hancock, then in command at Winchester, Va., that I had been seen at the theater in Washington on that fatal night. Fortunately, I could prove an alibi by Hancock himself, as I was at that very time negotiating a truce with him. I recently heard an officer of the United States Army tell a story of his being with the guard for a wagon train, and my passing him with my command on the pike, all of us dressed as Federal soldiers, and cutting the train out from behind him. I laughed at it, like everybody who heard it, and did not try to unsettle his faith. To have corrected it would have been as cruel as to dispel the illusion of childhood that the story of Little Red Riding Hood is literally true, or to doubt the real presence of Santa Claus. It was all pure fiction about our being dressed in blue uniforms, or riding with him. I did capture the wagon train at the time and place mentioned, October 26, 1863, at the Chestnut Fork, near Warrenton, Va., but we never even saw the guard. They had got sleepy and gone on to camp and left me to take care of their wagons, which I did. The quartermaster in charge of them, Captain Stone, who was made prisoner, called to pay his respects to me a few days ago. I can now very well understand how the legendary heroes of Greece were created. I always wore the Confederate uniform, with the insignia of my rank. So did my men. So any success I may have had, either as an individual scout or partisan commander, cannot be accounted for on the theory that it was accomplished through disguise. The hundreds of prisoners I took are witnesses to the contrary. Fauquier County, Va., 4. Februar 1863. General, I arrived in this neighborhood about 1 week ago. Since then I have been, despite the bad weather, quite actively engaged with the enemy. The result up to this time has been the capture of 28 Yankee cavalry, together with all their horses, arms, etc. The evidence of parole I forward with this. I have also paroled a number of deserters. Colonel Sir Percy Wyndham, with over 200 cavalry, came up to Middleburg last week to punish me, as he said, for my raids on his picket line. I had a slight skirmish with him, in which my loss was 3 men, captured by the falling of their horses. The enemy's loss, 1 man and 3 horses captured. He set a very nice trap a few days ago to catch me in. I went into it, but, contrary to the colonel's expectations, brought the trap off with me, killing 1, capturing 12, the balance running. The extent of the annoyance I have been to the Yankees may be judged of by the fact that, baffled in their attempts to capture me, they threatened to retaliate on citizens for my acts. I forward to you some correspondence I have had on the subject. The most of the infantry has left Fairfax and gone towards Fredericksburg. In Fairfax there are 5 or 6 regiments of cavalry. There are about 300 at Drainesville. They are so isolated from the rest of the command that nothing would be easier than their capture. I have harassed them so much that they do not keep their pickets over half a mile from camp. There is no artillery there. I start on another trip day after tomorrow. I am, most respectfully, yours, etc., John S. Mosby, Major, General J.E.B. Stuart, Headquarters Cavalry Division, February 8, 1863. Respectfully forwarded as additional proof of the prowess, daring, and efficiency of Mosby without commission, and his band of a dozen chosen spirits. J.E.B. Stuart, to Major General Commanding, Headquarters, February 11th, 1863. Respectfully forwarded to the Adjutant and Inspector General, as evidence of merit of Captain Mosby, R. E. Lee, General, Chapter 3. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, in December 1862, there was a lull in the storm of war. The men on the outposts along the Rappahannock had a sort of truce to hostilities and began swapping tobacco and coffee, just as the soldiers of Wellington and Soult, on the eve of a great battle, filled their canteens from the same stream. At that time, Stuart determined to make a Christmas raid about Dumfries, which was on Hooker's line of communication with Washington. I went with him. He got many prisoners, and wagons loaded with bonbons and all the good things of the festive season. It made us happy, but almost broke the sutlers' hearts. A regiment of Pennsylvania cavalry left their camp on the Occoquan and their Christmas turkeys, and came out to look for us. They had better have stayed at home, for all the good they did was to lead Stuart's cavalry into their camp as they ran through it. After leaving Dumfries, Stuart asked me to take Beatty and go on ahead. The road ran through a dense forest, and there was danger of an ambuscade, of which every soldier has a horror who has read of Braddock's defeat. Beatty and I went forward at a gallop, until we met a large body of cavalry. As no support was in sight, several officers made a dash at us, and at the same time opened such a fire as to show that peace on, earth, and goodwill to men, which the angels and morning stars had sung on that day over 1800 years ago, was no part of their creed. The very fact that we did not run away ought to have warned them that somebody was behind us. When the whole body had got within a short distance of us, Stuart, who had heard the firing, came thundering up with the one-stone Virginia cavalry. All the fun was over with the Pennsylvanians then. There was no more Merry Christmas for them. Wade Hampton was riding by the side of Stuart. He went into the fight and fought like a common, or rather, an uncommon trooper. The combat was short and sharp, and soon became a rout. The Federal cavalry ran right through their camp, and gave a last look at their turkeys as they passed. But alas, they were Greece, but living Greece no more for them. There was probably some method in their madness in running through their camp. They calculated, with good reason, that the temptation would stop the pursuit. A few days ago I read, in a book giving the history of the telegraph in the war, the dispatch sent to Washington by the operator near there, the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry just passed here, furiously charging to the rear. When we got to Burke's Station, on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, while his command was closing up, Stuart put his own operator in charge of the instrument and listened to a telegraphic conversation between the general commanding at Fairfax Courthouse and the authorities at Washington. In order to bewilder and puzzle them, he sent several messages, which put them on a false scent. Just before leaving, he sent a message to Quartermaster General Meigs complaining of the inferior quality of the mules recently furnished by him. The wire was then cut. Having learned by the telegraph that Fairfax Courthouse was held by a brigade of infantry, Stuart marched around north of it and went into Loudon, a land flowing with plenty. He made his headquarters at Colonel Rogers's near Dover and rested until the next day. On the morning he left, I went to his room and asked him to let me stay behind for a few days with a squad of men. I thought I could do something with them. He readily assented. I got 9 men, including of course Beatty, who volunteered to go with me. This was the beginning of my career as a partisan. The work I accomplished in 2 or 3 days with this squad induced him to let me have a larger force to try my fortune. I took my men down into Fairfax, and in 2 days captured 20 cavalrymen, with their horses, arms, and equipments. I had the good luck, by mere chance, to come across a forester named John Underwood, who knew every rabbit path in the county. He was a brave soldier as well as a good guide. His death a few months afterward, at the hands of a deserter from our own army, was one of the greatest losses I sustained in the war. I dismounted to capture one of the picket posts, who could be seen by the light of their fire in the woods. We walked up within a few yards of it. The men, never suspecting danger, were absorbed in a game of euchre. I halted and looked on for a minute or two, for I hated to spoil their sport. At last I fired a shot to let them know that their relief had come. Nobody was hurt, but one fellow was so much frightened that he nearly jumped over the tops of the trees. They submitted gracefully to the fate of war. I made them lie down by a fence and left a mounted man to stand guard over them, while I went to capture another post about 2 miles off. These were Vermont cavalry, and being from the land of steady habits did not indulge in cards like their New York friends, whom I had just left in the fence corner. I found them all sound asleep in a house, except the sentinel. Their horses were tied to the trees around it. The night was clear and crisp and cold. As we came from the direction of their camp, we were mistaken for the patrol until we got upon them. The challenge of the sentinel was answered by an order to charge, and it was all over with the boys from the Green Mountains. Their surprise was so great that they forgot that they had only pistols and carbines. If they had used them, being in a house, they might have driven us off. They made no resistance. The next day I started back to rejoin Stuart, who was near Fredericksburg. I found him in his tent, and when I reported what I had done, he expressed great delight. So he agreed to let me go back with 15 men and try my luck again. I went and never returned. I was not permitted to keep the men long. Fitzlee complained of his men being with me, and so I had to send them back to him. But while I had them, I kept things lively and humming. I made many raids on the cavalry outposts, capturing men, arms, and horses. Old men and boys had joined my band. Some had run the gauntlet of Yankee pickets, and others swam the Potomac to get to me. Most men love the excitement of fighting, but abhor the drudgery of camps. I mounted, armed, and equipped my command at the expense of the United States government. There was a Confederate hospital in Middleburg, where a good many wounded Confederate soldiers had been left during our Maryland campaign a few months before. These were now convalescent. I utilized them. They would go down to Fairfax on a raid with me, and then return to the hospital. When the Federal cavalry came in pursuit, they never suspected that the cripples they saw lying on their couches or hobbling about on crutches were the men who created the panic at night in their camps. At last I got one of the cripples killed, and that somewhat abated their ardor. There are many comic as well as tragic elements that fill up the drama of war. One night I went down to Fairfax to take a cavalry picket. When I got near the post, I stopped at the house of one Ben Hatton. I had heard that he had visited the picket post that day to give some information to them about me. I gave him the choice of Castle Thunder or guiding me through the pines to the rear of the picket. Ben did not hesitate to go with me. Like the Vicar of Bray, he was in favor of the party in power. There was a deep snow on the ground, and when we got in sight of the picket fire, I halted and dismounted my men. As Ben had done all I wanted of him, and was a non-combatant, I did not want to expose him to the risk of getting shot, and so I left. Him with a man named Gall, generally called Coonskin from the cap he wore, and Jimmy, an Irishman, to guard our horses, which we left in the pines. With the other men I went to make the attack on foot. The snow being soft, we made no noise, and had them all prisoners almost before they got their eyes open. But just then a fusillade was opened in the rear, where our horses were. Leaving a part of my men to bring on the prisoners, we mounted the captured horses and dashed back to the place where I had dismounted, to meet what I supposed was an attempt of the enemy to make a reprisal on me. When I got there, I found Ben Hatton lying in a snowbank, shot through the thigh, but Jimmy and Coonskin had vanished. All that Ben knew was that he had been shot. He said that the Yankees had attacked their party, but whether they had carried off Jimmy and Coonskin, or Jimmy and Coonskin had carried them, he couldn't tell. What made the mystery greater was that all our horses were standing just as we left them, including the 2 belonging to the missing men. With our prisoners and spoil, we started home, Ben Hatton riding behind one of the men. Ben had lost a good deal of blood, but he managed to hold on. When we got into the road, we met a body of Wyndham's cavalry coming up to cut us off. They stopped and opened fire on us. I knew this was a good sign and that they were not coming to close quarters in the dark. We went on by them. By daybreak, I was 20 miles away. As soon as it was daylight, Wyndham set out full speed up the pike to catch me. He might as well have been chasing the silver-footed antelope that gracefully and gaily springs, as o'er the marble courts of kings. I was at a safe distance before he started. He got to Middleburg during the day with his horses all jaded and blown. He learned there that I had passed through about the dawn of day. He returned to camp with the most of his command leading their broken-down horses. In fact, his pursuit had done him more damage than my attack. He was an English officer, trained in the cavalry schools of Europe, but he did not understand such business. This affair was rather hard on Ben Hatton. He was the only man that got a hurt, and that was all he got. As it was only a flesh wound, it healed quickly, but even if he had died from it, fame would have denied her requiem to his name. His going with me had been as purely involuntary as if he had been carried out with a halter round his neck to be hanged. I left him at his house, coiled up in bed, within a few hundred yards of the Yankee pickets. He was too close to the enemy for me to give him any surgical assistance, and he had to keep his wound a profound secret in the neighborhood, for fear the Yankees would hear of it and how he got it. If they had ever found it out, Ben's wife would have been made a widow. In a day or so, Coonskin and Jimmy came in, but by different directions. We had given them up for lost. They trudged on foot through the snow all the way up from Fairfax. Neither one knew that Ben Hatton had been shot. Each one supposed that all the others were prisoners, and he the only one left to tell the tale of the disaster. Both firmly believed that they had been attacked by the enemy, and after fighting as long as Sir John Falstaff did by Shrewsbury Clock, had been forced to yield, but they could not account for all our horses being where we left them. The mistakes of the night had been more ludicrous than any of the incidents of Goldsmith's immortal comedy. She stoops to conquer. By a comparison of the statements of the three, I found out that the true facts were these. In order to keep themselves warm, they had walked around the horses a good deal and got separated. Coonskin saw Jimmy and Ben Hatton moving about in the shadow of a tree and took them to be Yankees. He immediately opened on them and drew blood at the first fire. Hatton yelled and fell. Jimmy, taking it for granted that Coonskin was a Yankee, returned his fire, and so they were dodging and shooting at each other from behind trees until they saw us come dashing up. As we had left them on foot a short while before, it never occurred to them that we were coming back on the captured horses. After fighting each other by mistake and wounding Ben Hatton, they had run away from us. It was an agreeable surprise to them to find that I had their horses. Ben Hatton will die in the belief that the Yankees shot him, for I never told him any better. I regret that historical truth forbids my concluding this comedy according to the rules of the drama. With a marriage, Fauquier County, VA, February 28, 1863. General, I have the honor to report that at 4 o'clock on the morning of the 26th instant I attacked and routed on the Ox Road in Fairfax, about 2 miles from Germantown, a cavalry outpost consisting of a lieutenant and 50 men. The enemy's loss was 1 lieutenant and 3 men killed, and 5 captured, number of wounded not known, also 39 horses, with all their accoutrements, brought off. There were also 3 horses killed. I did not succeed in gaining the rear of the post as I expected, having been discovered by a vidette when several hundred yards off, who fired and gave the alarm, which compelled me to charge them in front. In the terror and confusion occasioned by our terrific yells, the most of them saved themselves by taking refuge in a dense thicket, where the darkness effectually concealed them. There was also a reserve of 100 men half a mile off who might come to the rescue. Already encumbered with prisoners and horses, we were in no condition for fighting. I sustained no loss. The enemy made a small show of fight, but quickly yielded. They were in log houses, with the chinking knocked out, and ought to have held them against a greatly superior force, as they all had carbines. My men behaved very gallantly, although mostly raw recruits. I had only 27 men with me. I am still receiving additions to my numbers. If you would let me have some of the dismounted men of the 1st Cavalry, I would undertake to mount them. I desire some written instructions from you with reference to exportation of products within the enemy's lines. I wish the bearer of this to bring back some ammunition, also some large-size envelopes and blank paroles. I have failed to mention the fact the enemy pursued me as far as Middleburg without accomplishing anything, etc. Jano, S. Mosby, Major, General J. E. B. Stewart, Fairfax Courthouse, January 27, 1863. Sir, last night my pickets were driven in by some of Stewart's cavalry, wounding 1 and capturing 9. I then started with some 200 men in pursuit. Some 27 miles beyond my pickets at Middleburg, I came up with them and after a short skirmish captured 24 of them. I have just returned. P. Wyndham, Captain Carroll H. Porter, Assistant Adjutant General. Chapter 4. It was the latter part of January, 1863, when I crossed the Rappahannock into northern Virginia, which from that time until the close of the war was the theater on which I conducted partisan operations. The country had been abandoned to the occupation of the Federal Army the year before, when Johnston retired from Centerville, and had never been held by us afterward, except during the short time when the Confederate Army was passing through in General Lee's first campaign into Maryland. I told Stuart that I would by incessant attacks compel the enemy either greatly to contract his lines or to reinforce them, either of which would be of great advantage to the Southern cause. The means supplied me were hardly adequate to the end I proposed, but I thought that zeal and celerity of movement would go far to compensate for the deficiency of my numbers. There was a great stake to be won, and I resolved to play a bold game to win it. I think that Stuart was the only man in the Army of Northern Virginia, except 2 or 3 who accompanied me and knew me well, who expected that I would accomplish anything. Other detachments of cavalry had been sent there at different times that had done little or nothing. Nearly every one thought that I was starting out on a quixotic enterprise that would result in doing no harm to the enemy, but simply in getting all of my own men killed or captured. When at last I secured an independent command for which I had so longed, I was as happy as Columbus when he set forth from the port of Palos with the 3 little barks Isabella had given him to search for an unknown continent. My faith was strong, and I never for a moment had a feeling of discouragement or doubted my ability to reap a rich harvest from what I knew was still an ungleaned field. I stopped an hour or so at Warrenton, which has always been a sort of political shrine from which the Delphian Apollo issues his oracles. After the war I made it my home, and it is generally supposed that I resided there before the war. The fact is that I never was in that section of Virginia until I went there as a soldier. The Union soldiers knew just as much about the country as I did. I recall vividly to mind the looks of surprise and the ominous shaking of the heads of the augurs when I told them that I proposed going farther north to begin the war again along the Potomac. Their criticism on my command was pretty much the same as that pronounced on the English mission to Kabul some years ago, that it was too small for an army and too large for an embassy. When I bade my friends at the Warren Green Hotel goodbye, I had their best wishes for my success, but nothing more. They all thought that I was going on the foolhardy enterprise of an Arctic voyager in search of the North Pole. My idea was to make the Piedmont region of the country lying between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers the base of my operations. This embraces the upper portion of the counties of Fauquier and Loudoun. It is a rich pastoral country, which afforded subsistence for my command, while the Blue Ridge was a safe point to which to retreat if hard-pressed by the superior numbers that could be sent against us. It was inhabited by a highly refined and cultivated population who were thoroughly devoted to the Southern cause. Although that region was the Flanders of the war, and harried worse than any of which history furnishes an example since the desolation of the Palatinates by Louis XIV, yet the stubborn faith of the people never wavered. Amid fire and sword they remained true to the last and supported me through all the trials of the war. While the country afforded an abundance of subsistence, it was open and scant of forests, with no natural defensive advantages for repelling hostile incursions. There was no such shelter there as Marion had in the swamps of the Pedee, to which he retreated. It was always my policy to avoid fighting at home as much as possible, for the plain reason that it would have encouraged an overwhelming force to come again, and that the services of my own command would have been neutralized by the force sent against it. Even if I defeated them, they would return with treble numbers. On the contrary, it was safer for me, and greater results could be secured, by being the aggressor and striking the enemy at unguarded points. I could thus compel him to guard 100 points, while I could select any one of them for attack. If I could do so, I generally slipped over when my territory was invaded and imitated Scipio by carrying the war into the enemy's camps. 1. Kernstown, Va. November 26, 1864. Sheridan to Halleck. I will soon commence work on Mosby. Heretofore I have made no attempt to break him up, as I would have employed 10 men to his 1, and for the reason that I have made a scapegoat of him for the destruction of private rights. Now there is going to be an intense hatred of him in that portion of the valley which is nearly a desert. I will soon commence on Loudoun County, and let them know there is a God in Israel. Mosby has annoyed me considerably, but the people are beginning to see that he does not injure me a great deal, but causes a loss to them of all that they have spent their lives in accumulating. Those people who live in the vicinity of Harper's Ferry are the most villainous in this valley, and have not yet been hurt much. If the railroad is interfered with, I will make some of them poor. Those who live at home in peace and plenty want the duello part of this war to go on. But when they have to bear the burden by loss of property and comforts, they will cry for peace. When Sheridan started in March 1865 from Winchester to join Grant in front of Petersburg, he left my command behind him, more flourishing than it ever had been. The intense hatred he had hoped to excite in the people of the valley for me by burning their homes was only felt for him. They were not willing that I should be a scapegoat to bear another's sins. I have seen it stated in the reports of some Federal officers that they would throw down the gauge of battle to me in my own country, and that I would not accept it. I was not in the habit of doing what they wanted me to do. Events showed that my judgment was correct. After I had once occupied, I never abandoned it, although the wave of invasion several times rolled over it. News of the surrender, or rather the evacuation of Richmond, came to me one morning in April 1865, at North Fork in Loudoun County, where my command had assembled to go on a raid. Just 2 or 3 days before that I had defeated Colonel Reno with the 12th Pennsylvania Cavalry at Hamilton, a few miles from there, which was the last fight in which I commanded. Reno afterward enjoyed some notoriety in connection with the Custer Massacre. My purpose was to weaken the armies invading Virginia by harassing their rear. As a line is only as strong as its weakest point, it was necessary for it to be stronger than I was at every point, in order to resist my attacks. It is easy, therefore, to see the great results that may be accomplished by a small body of cavalry moving rapidly from point to point on the communications of an army, to destroy supply trains, to break up the means of conveying intelligence, and thus isolating an army from its base as well as its different corps from each other, to confuse their plans by capturing dispatches, are the objects of partisan war. It is just as legitimate to fight an enemy in the rear as in front. The only difference is in the danger. Now, to prevent all these things from being done, heavy detachments must be made to guard against them. The military value of a partisan's work is not measured by the amount of property destroyed or the number of men killed or captured, but by the number he keeps watching. Every soldier withdrawn from the front to guard the rear of an army is so much taken from its fighting strength. I endeavored as far as I was able to diminish this aggressive power of the Army of the Potomac by compelling it to keep a large force on the defensive. I assailed its rear, for there was its most vulnerable point. My men had no camps. If they had gone into camp, they would soon have all been captured. They would scatter for safety and gather at my call like the children of the mist. A blow would be struck at a weak or unguarded point, and then a quick retreat. The alarm would spread through the sleeping camp, the long roll would be beaten, or the bugles would sound to horse. There would be mounting in hot haste and a rapid pursuit. But the partisans generally got off with their prey. Their pursuers were striking at an invisible foe. I often sent small squads at night to attack and run in the pickets along a line of several miles. Of course, these alarms were very annoying, for no human being knows how sweet sleep is but a soldier. I wanted to use and consume the Northern cavalry in hard work. I have often thought that their fierce hostility to me was more on account of the sleep I made them lose than the number we killed and captured. It has always been a wonder with people how I managed to collect my men after dispersing them. The true secret was that it was a fascinating life, and its attractions far more than counterbalanced its hardships and dangers. They had no camp duty to do, which, however necessary, is disgusting to soldiers of high spirit. To put them to such routine work is pretty much like hitching a racehorse to a plow. Many expeditions were undertaken and traps laid to capture us, but all failed, and my command continued to grow and flourish until the final scene at Appomattox. It had just reached its highest point of efficiency when the time came to surrender. We did not go into a number of traps set to catch us, but somehow we always brought the traps off with us. One stratagem was after the model of the Grecian horse, and would have done credit to Ulysses. They sent a train of wagons up the Little River Turnpike from Fairfax, apparently without any guard, thinking that such a bait would surely catch me. But in each wagon were concealed 6 of the bucktails, who would, no doubt, have stopped my career if I had given them a chance. Fortunately, I never saw them, for on that very day I had gone by another route down to Fairfax. When the bucktails returned, they had the satisfaction of knowing that I had been there in their absence. At that time, Hooker's army was in winter quarters on the Rappahannock, with a line of communication with Washington, both by land and water. The troops belonging to the defenses at Washington were mostly cantoned in Fairfax, with their advance post at Centerville. West of the Blue Ridge, Milroy occupied Winchester. From my rendezvous east of the ridge, I could move on the radius and strike any point on the circumference of the circle which was not too strongly guarded. But if I compelled them to be stronger everywhere than I was, then so much the better. I had done my work. Panics had often occurred in the camp when we were not near. The pickets became so nervous expecting attacks that they fired at every noise. It was thought that the honor as well as the safety of the army required that these depredations should no longer be endured, and that something must be done to stop them. Of course, the best way to do it was to exterminate the band, as William of Orange did the MacDonald of Glencoe. A cavalry expedition, under a Major Gilmer, was sent up to Loudon to do the work. He had conceived the idea that I had my headquarters in Middleburg, and might be caught by surrounding the place in the night-time. He arrived before daybreak, and threw a cordon of pickets around it. At the dawn of day he had the village as completely invested as Metz was by the Germans. He then gradually contracted his lines, and proceeded in person to the hotel where he supposed I was in bed. I was not there, I never had been. Soldiers were sent around to every house with orders to arrest every man they could find. When he drew in his net, there was not a single soldier in it. He had, however, caught a number of old men. It was a frosty morning, and he amused himself by making a soldier take them through a squad drill to keep them warm. Occasionally he would make them mark time in the street front of the hotel. All this afforded a good deal of fun to the Major, but was rather rough on the old men. He thought, or pretended to think, that they were the parties who had attacked his pickets. After a night march of 25 miles, he did not like to return to camp without some trophies, so he determined to carry the graybeards with him. He mounted each one behind a trooper and started off. Now, it so happened that I had notified my men to meet that morning at Rector's Cross Roads, which is about 4 miles above Middleburg. When I got there, I heard that the latter place was occupied by Federal cavalry. With 17 men, I started down the pike to look after them. Of course, with my small force, all that I could expect to do was to cut off some straggling parties who might be marauding about the neighborhood. When I got near Middleburg, I learned that they had gone. We entered the town at a gallop. The ladies all immediately crowded around us. There were, of course, no men among them. Major Gilmer had taken them with him. There was, of course, great indignation at the rough usage they had received, and their wives never expected to see them again. And then, to add to the pathos of the scene, were the tears and lamentations of the daughters. There were many as pure and as bright as any pearl that ever shone in Oman's green water. Their beauty had won the hearts of many of my men. To avenge the wrongs of distressed damsels is one of the vows of knighthood, so we spurred on to overtake the Federal cavalry, in hopes that by some accident of war we might be able to liberate the prisoners. Chapter 5. Still o'er these scenes my memory wakes, and fondly broods with miser care time, but the impression stronger makes as streams their channels deeper wear. Burns. About 5 miles below Middleburg is the village of Aldie, where I expected that the Federal cavalry would halt. But when I got within a mile of it, I met a citizen just from the place, who told me the cavalry had passed through. With 5 or 6 men I rode forward while the others followed on more slowly. Just as I rose to the top of the hill on the outskirts of the village, I suddenly came upon 2 Federal cavalrymen ascending from the opposite side. Neither party had been aware of the approach of the other, and our meeting was so unexpected that our horses' heads nearly butted together before we could stop. They surrendered, of course, and were sent to the rear. They said that they had been sent out as vedettes. Looking down the hill, I saw before me several mounted men in the road, whom I took to be a part of the rear guard of Major Gilmer's column. We dashed after them. I was riding a splendid horse, a noble bay. Job's war horse was a Mustang compared to him, who had now got his mettle up and carried me at headlong speed right among them. I had no more control over him than Mazeppa had over the Ukraine steed to which he was bound. I had scarcely started in the charge before I discovered that there was a body of cavalry dismounted at a mill near the roadside, which I had not before seen. They were preparing to feed their horses. As their pickets had given no alarm, they had no idea that an enemy was near, and were stunned and dazed by the apparition of a body of men who they imagined must have dropped from the clouds upon them. The fact was that we were as much surprised as they were. I was unable to stop my horse when I got to them, but he kept straight on like a streak of lightning. Fortunately, the dismounted troopers were so much startled that it never occurred to them to take a shot at me in transitupor. They took it for granted that an overwhelming force was on them, and every man was for saving himself. Some took to the Bull Run Mountain, which was nearby, and others ran into the mill and buried themselves like rats in the wheat bins. The mill was grinding, and some were so much frightened that they jumped into the hoppers and came near being ground up into flour. When we pulled them out, there was nothing blue about them. As I have stated, my horse ran with me past the mill. My men stopped there and went to work, but I kept on, and now another danger loomed up in front of me. Just ahead was the bridge over Little River, and on the opposite bank I saw another body of cavalry looking on in a state of bewildered excitement. They saw the stampede at the mill and a solitary horseman, pistol in hand, riding full speed right into their ranks. They never fired a shot. Just as I got to the bridge, I jumped off my horse to save myself from capture, but just at the same moment they wheeled and took to their heels down the pike. They had seen the rest of my men coming up. If I had known that they were going to run, I would have stayed on my horse. They went clattering down the pike, with my horse thundering after them. He chased them all the way into the camp. They never drew rein until they got inside their picket lines. I returned on foot to the mill. Not a half a dozen shots were fired. All that couldn't get away surrendered. But just then a Federal officer made his appearance at the bridge. He had ridden down the river, and having just returned had heard the firing but did not comprehend the situation. Tom Turner of Maryland, one of the bravest of my men, dashed at him. As Turner was alone, I followed him. I now witnessed a single-handed fight between him and the officer. For want of numbers, it was not so picturesque as the combat described by Livy between the Horatii and the Curatii, nor did such momentous issues depend upon it. But the gallantry displayed was equally as great. Before I got up, I saw the horse of the Federal officer fall dead upon him, and at the same time Turner seemed about to fall from his horse. The Federal officer, who was Captain Worthington of the Vermont cavalry, had fired while lying under his horse at Turner and inflicted quite a severe wound. The first thing Turner said to me was that his adversary had first surrendered, which threw him off his guard, and then fired on him. Worthington denied it, and said his shot was fired in fair fight. I called some of the men to get him out from under his horse. He was too much injured by the fall to be taken away, so I paroled and left him with a family there to be cared for. While all this was going on, the men were busy at the mill. They had a good deal of fun pulling the Vermont boys out of the wheat bins. The first one they brought out was so caked with flour that I thought they had the miller. We got the commanding officer, Captain Huttoon, and 19 men and 23 horses, with their arms and equipments. I lingered behind with one man and sent the captures back to Middleburg. Now all the ladies there had been watching and listening as anxiously to hear from us as Andromache and her maids did for the news of the combat between Hector and Achilles. Presently they saw a line of blue coats coming up the pike, with some gray ones mixed among them. Then the last ray of hope departed. They thought we were all prisoners, and that the foe was returning to insult them. One of the most famous of my men, Dick Moran, rode forward as a herald of victory. He had the voice of a foghorn, and proclaimed the glad tidings to the town. While I was still sitting on my horse at the mill, 3 more of the Vermont men, thinking that all of us had gone, came out from their hiding place. I sent them on after the others. Up to this time I had been under the impression that it was Major Gilmer's rear guard that I had overtaken. I now learned that this was a body of Vermont cavalry that had started that morning several hours after Gilmer had left. They had halted to feed their horses at the mill. As they came up, they had seen a body of cavalry turn off towards Centerville. That was all they knew. I then rode down the road to look after my horse that I had lost. I had not gone far before I met the old men that Major Gilmer had taken off. They were all happy at the ludicrous streak of fortune that had brought them deliverance. It seems that Major Gilmer knew nothing of the intention of Captain Huttoon to pay Middleburg a visit that day. When he got below Aldie, he saw a considerable body of cavalry coming from the direction of Fairfax. It never occurred to him that they were his own people. He took them for my men and thought I was trying to surround him. Even if he did think the force he saw was my command, it is hard to understand why he should run away from the very thing that he was in search of. But so he did. Just at the point where he was when he saw the Vermont men, the pike crosses the old Braddock Road. It is the same on which the British general marched with young George Washington to death and defeat on the Monongahela. Major Gilmer turned and started down the Braddock Road at about the speed that John Gilpin rode to Edmonton on his wedding day. The ground was soft, and his horses sank knee-deep in the mud at every jump. Of course, those broke down first that were carrying 2. As he thought he was hard-pressed, he kept on fast and furious, taking no heed of those he left on the roadside. It was necessary to sacrifice a part to save the rest. Long before he got to Centerville, about one-half of his horses were sticking in the mud, and all his prisoners had been abandoned. They had to walk home. Major Gilmer never came after me again. I heard that he resigned his commission in disgust, and with Othello bade farewell to the big wars that make ambition virtue. There was rejoicing in Middleburg that evening, all ascribed to a special providence, the advent of the Vermont cavalry just in time to stampede the New Yorkers and make them drop their prisoners, and that my horse had run away and carried me safely through the Vermont squadron. The miller, too, was happy because I had appeared just in time to save his corn. At night, with song and dance, we celebrated the events and forgot the dangers of the day. Headquarters Cavalry Brigade, Fairfax Courthouse, VA, March 3, 1863. Sir, by order of Colonel R.B. Price, I directed on the night of the 1st instant a reconnaissance to go in direction of Aldie. The officer who commanded this reconnaissance was Major Joseph Gilmer of the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He had 200 men. The orders to him were to proceed carefully and send back couriers through the night with information whether they saw any enemy or not. This last order was disobeyed. They were not to cross Cub Run until daylight, and then try and gain all information possible by flankers and small detached scouting parties. Major Gilmer went to Middleburg, and while returning, the vedettes of the 1st Vermont Cavalry noticed a part of his advance and prepared to skirmish. The advance fell back toward Aldie. Major Gilmer, instead of throwing out a party to reconnoiter, turned off with nearly the whole of his command in the direction of Groveton. To gain Centerville, the horses returned exhausted from being run at full speed for miles. A few of Major Gilmer's men left his command and went along the Little River Turnpike toward the Vermont detachment. They reported that the men seen were a part of a scouting party under Major Gilmer, and that no enemy were in Aldie. Captain Huttoon then entered the town and halted to have the horses fed near a mill. Immediately beyond was a rising ground which hid the guerrillas. While the horses were unbridled and feeding, the surprise occurred. As both the officers have been captured, and as the detachment was not under my command, and is not attached to this brigade, I have no means of receiving any official or exact report from them, nor is there anyone belonging to that detachment here. All men belonging to this detachment seem to have fought well. The enemy did not pursue them. They fell back in good order. Major Gilmer, when he returned, was unable to make a report to Lute. Colonel John S. Krebs, who during the time I was confined from sickness had charge of the camp, I ordered Major Gilmer under arrest early this morning, and have sent to Colonel R.B. Price charges, of which the annexed is a copy. Major Gilmer lost but one man, belonging to the 5th New York Cavalry, who was mortally wounded by the enemy and afterwards robbed. He was away from the command, and on this side of Aldie, his horse having given out, the enemy seemed to have been concealed along the line of march and murdered this man. When returning without provocation, I have the honor to be, very respectfully, your obedient servant, Rop Johnstone, a Lute. Colonel Commanding Cavalry Brigade, Captain C. H. Potter, an Assistant Adjutant General, General Orders War Department. Adjutant General's Office, Number 229, to Washington, first before a General Court-Martial, which convened in the city of Washington, D.C., March 27, 1863, pursuant to General Orders. No. 20, dated Headquarters Cavalry, Defenses of Washington, near Fort Scott, Virginia, February 2, 1863, and Special Orders. No. 146, dated February 10, 1863, number 150, dated February 16, 1863, number 161, dated March 6, 1863, and No. 164, dated March 21, 1863, Headquarters Cavalry, Department of Washington, and of which Colonel E.B. Sawyer, One Stone Vermont Cavalry, is president, was arraigned and tried. Major Joseph Gilmer, 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, charge ein, drunkenness. In this that Joseph Gilmer tent, a major of the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, he then being in the service of the United States and while in command of a reconnoitering party, on the 2nd day of March, 1863, was so intoxicated from the effects of spirituous liquors as to be incapacitated to perform his duties in an officer-like manner. This at or near the village of Aldie, in the state of Virginia, charge 2, cowardice. In this, that Joseph Gilmer Tomer, a major in the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, he then being in the service of the United States upon the 2nd day of March 1863, did permit and encourage a detachment of cavalry in the service of the United States and under his command to fly from a small body of the One-Stone Vermont cavalry who were mistaken for the enemy, without sending out any person or persons to ascertain who they were, or what were their numbers, and that the said cavalry under his command, as above stated, were much demoralized, and fled many miles through the country in great confusion and disorder. This near Aldie, in the state of Virginia, to which charges and specifications the accused, Major Joseph Gilmer, 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, pleaded not guilty. Finding, the court, having maturely considered the evidence adduced, finds the accused, Major Joseph Gilmer, 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, as follows. Charge I, of the specification, guilty. Of the charge, guilty. Charge second, of the specification, guilty. Of the charge, not guilty. Sentence. And the court does therefore sentence him, Major Joseph Gilmer, 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, to be cashiered. Second, the proceedings of the court in the above case were disapproved by the Major General commanding the Department of Washington on account of fatal defects and irregularities in the record, but the testimony shows that the accused was drunk on duty and brought disgrace upon himself and the service. The President directs that, as recommended by the Department Commander, he be dismissed the service, and Major Joseph Gilmer, 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, accordingly ceases to be an officer in the United States service since the 20th day of July, 1863. By order of the Secretary of War, E.D. Townsend, an Assistant Adjutant General, Fairfax Courthouse, March 2nd, 1863. Sir, 50 men of the 1st Vermont Cavalry from Companies H and M, under Captains Huttoon and Woodward, were surprised in Aldie while feeding their horses by about 70% of the enemy, both captains captured and about 15 men. They saw no enemy but the attacking party. Major Gilmer has returned with the scouting party that left last night. They were to Middleburg and saw but one rebel. I have anticipated the report of Lieutenant Colonel Krebs, now in command, which will be forwarded in probably 1 hour. Ropt Johnstone, Lieutenant Colonel, commanding Cavalry Brigade. Captain C.H. Potter, Assistant Adjutant General. Chapter 6. Within a few weeks after I began operations in Northern Virginia, I received accessions to my command from various sources. I have before spoken of the convalescents in the hospital at Middleburg, out of whom I got some valuable service. The Confederate government did not furnish horses to the cavalry, but paid each man 40 cents a day compensation for the use of his horse. When the trooper lost his horse, or it became disabled, he was given a furlough to go to get another. A great many of this class of men came to me, to whom I would furnish captured horses in consideration of their going with me on a few raids. I made a proposition to mount all the dismounted men of Fitz Lee's brigade in consideration of their serving with me a short time. It was declined, and they were sent over to Fauquier under command of an ambitious officer who thought, like Sam Patch when he leaped over Genesee Falls, that some things could be done as well as others. Reports of my forays, which had been almost uniformly successful, had spread through the army, and it seemed, after the thing had been done, to be a very easy thing to surprise and capture cavalry outposts. The result of this attempt at imitation was that all the dismounted men were returned as prisoners of war via Fort Monroe, the mounted officer who commanded them alone escaping capture. About this time I received a valuable recruit in the person of Sir Dames of the 5th New York Cavalry, who deserted his regiment to join me. I never really understood what his motives were in doing so. I never cared to inquire. The men of my command insisted that I should treat him simply as a prisoner, and send him back to join many of his comrades whom I had sent to Richmond. After a long conversation with him, I felt an instinctive confidence in his sincerity. He came to me on foot, but proposed to return to camp and mount himself if I would receive him. It happened that a young man named Walter Franklin was present, who also came on foot to join my standard. With my consent, they agreed to walk down to Fairfax that night, enter the cavalry camp on foot, and ride out on 2 of the best horses they could find. At the same time, I started off on an expedition in another direction. I had not gone far before I struck the trail of a raiding party of cavalry that had been off into Loudon committing depredations on the citizens. I met old Dr. Drake walking home through snow and mud knee-deep. He told me that the Federal cavalry had met him in the road, while he was going around to attend to the sick, and had not only taken his horse but also his saddlebags, with all his medicines. As the Confederacy was then in a state of blockade, medicine was more valuable than gold, and great suffering would be inflicted on a community by the loss even of Dr. Drake's small stock. He told us that the marauders were not far ahead, and we spurred on to overtake them. Fortunately, as they were not far from their camps, they deemed themselves safe, and scattered over the country a good deal. Before going very far, we overtook a party that had stopped to plunder a house. As they were more intent on saving their plunder than fighting, they scampered off, but we were close on their heels. We had intercepted them and were between them and their camp, so they had to run in an opposite direction. But very soon they came to a narrow stream, the Horseman Run, which was booming with the melted snow. The man on the fleetest horse, who was some distance in advance of the others, plunged in and narrowly escaped being drowned. He was glad to get back even as a prisoner. The others did not care to follow his example, but quietly submitted to manifest destiny. We got them all. They were loaded down mostly with silver spoons, of which they had despoiled the houses they had visited, but the richest prize of all we got was old Dr. Drake's saddlebags. I was strongly tempted to administer to each one of the prisoners a purge by way of making them expiate their offense. Now, when Dr. Drake parted with his saddlebags, he never expected to see them again, and supposed that as long as the war lasted his occupation would be gone. As a doctor without medicine and implements of surgery is like a soldier without arms, his surprise and delight may be imagined when a few hours afterward his saddlebags and the captured silver were brought to him to be restored to the owners. We then proceeded on toward Frying Pan, where I had heard that a cavalry picket was stationed and waiting for me to come after them. I did not want them to be disappointed in their desire to visit Richmond. When I got within a mile of it, and had stopped for a few minutes to make my disposition for attack, I observed two ladies walking rapidly toward me. One was Miss Laura Ratcliffe, a young lady to whom Stuart had introduced me a few weeks before, when returning from his raid on Dumfries, with her sister. Their home was near Frying Pan, and they had got information of a plan to capture me, and were just going to the house of a citizen to get him to put me on my guard, when fortune brought them across my path. But for meeting them, my life as a partisan would have closed that day. There was a cavalry post in sight at Frying Pan, but near there, in the pines, a large body of cavalry had been concealed. It was expected that I would attack the picket, but that my momentary triumph would be like the fabled Dead Sea's fruit, ashes to the taste, as the party in the pines would pounce from their hiding place upon me. A garrulous lieutenant had disclosed the plot to the young lady, never dreaming that she would walk through the snow to get the news to me. This was not the only time during the war when I owed my escape from danger to the tact of a Southern woman. I concluded then to go in the direction of Drainesville in search of game. When we reached Herndon Station, I learned that the contents of a sutler's wagon that had broken down when passing there that day were concealed in a barn nearby. The sutler had gone into camp to get another team to haul his goods in. In the exercise of our belligerent rights, we proceeded to relieve him of any further trouble in taking care of them. He had a splendid stock of cavalry boots, with which he seemed to have been provided in anticipation of the wants of my men. Now, loaded down with what was to us a richer prize than the Golden Fleece, we started back, but could not forbear taking along a cavalry picket near, by which was not looking for us, as it had been understood that we were to attack Frying Pan that night, where preparations had been made to receive us. Once more I had tempted fortune, and from the nettle danger had plucked the flower safety. On my return to Middleburg I found Ames and Franklin there in advance of me. They had entered the camp of the 5th New York Cavalry at night on foot, and had ridden out on two of the finest horses they could find in the stables. They had passed in and out without ever having been molested or challenged by the guard. Ames had not had time to exchange his suit of blue for a gray one, but Franklin was in full Confederate uniform. It was a perfectly legitimate enterprise, certainly, as open and bold as the capture in the night-time of the Palladium of Troy by Ulysses and Diomede. But still the men were not satisfied of Ames's good faith. They said that he had not betrayed Franklin because he wanted to entrap us all at one time. A few days after that, I once more put him to a test which convinced the men of his truth and fidelity. He seemed to burn with an implacable feeling of revenge toward his old companions in arms. I never had a truer or more devoted follower. He was killed in a skirmish in October 1864, and carried the secret of his desertion to the grave. I had made him a lieutenant, and he had won by his courage and general deportment the respect and affection of my men. They all sincerely mourned his death. Since the war I have often passed his lonely grave in a clump of trees on the very spot where he fell. The soldier who killed him was in the act of taking his arms off when one of my men rode up and shot him. Ames is a prominent figure in the history of my command. It was my habit either to go myself with 1 or 2 men, or to send scouts to find out some weak and exposed place in the enemy's lines. I rarely rested for more than 1 day at a time. As soon as I knew of a point offering a chance for a successful attack, I gathered my men together and struck a blow. From the rapidity with which these attacks were delivered and repeated, and the distant points at which they were made, a most exaggerated estimate of the number of my force was made. I have before spoken of John Underwood, to whose courage and skill as a guide I was so much indebted for my earlier successes. He was equally at home threading a thick labyrinth of pines in Fairfax or leading a charge. He was among the first everywhere, and I always rewarded his zeal. About this time I had sent him down on a scout, from which he returned informing me that a picket of 30 or 40 cavalry had been placed at Herndon Station on the Loudon and Hampshire Railroad. This was the very place where I had got the sutler's wagon the week before. I could hardly believe it. I thought it must be another trap, for I could not imagine why such a number of men should be put there except for the purpose of getting caught. I had supposed that the enemy had been taught something by experience. I collected my men and started down, though I did not expect to find anyone at Herndon when I got there. Fearing an ambuscade, and also hearing that the reserve at the post stayed in a house, I thought I would try my luck in the daytime. Besides, as most of my attacks had been made at night, I knew they would not expect me in the day. Underwood conducted me by all sorts of crooked paths through the dense forests, until we got in their rear. We then advanced at a walk along the road leading to their camp at Drainesville, until we came upon a vidette, who saw us, but did not have time either to fire or to run away. He was ours before he recovered his senses, he was so much surprised. About 200 yards in front of us I could see the boys in blue lounging around an old sawmill, with their horses tied by their halters to the fence. It was past 12 o'clock and the sun was shining brightly, but there was a deep snow on the ground. They were as unconscious of the presence of danger as if they had been at their own peaceful homes among the Green Mountains. It happened to be just the hour for the relief to come from their camp at Drainesville. They saw us approaching, but mistook us for friends. When we got within 100 yards, I ordered a charge. They had no time to mount their horses and fled, panic-stricken, into the sawmill, and took refuge on the upper floor. I knew that if I gave them time to recover from the shock of their surprise, they could hold the mill with their carbines against my force until reinforcements reached them. The promptness with which the opportunity was seized is the reason that they were lost and we were saved. They were superior in numbers, with the advantage of being under cover. The last ones had hardly got inside the mill before we were upon them. I dismounted and rushed into the mill after them, followed by John de Butts. The enemy were all above me. As I started up the steps, I ordered the men to set fire to the mill. I knew that this order would be heard overhead and increase the panic. The mill was full of dry timber and shavings that would have burned them to cinders in 10 minutes. As I reached the head of the stairway, I ordered a surrender. They all did so. They had the alternative of doing this or being roasted alive. In a minute more, the mill would have been in flames. Against such an enemy they had no weapon of defense, and in preference to cremation, chose to be prisoners. On going out and remounting, I observed 4 finely caparisoned horses standing in front of the house of Nat Hanna, a Union man. I knew that the horses must have riders, and that from their equipments they must be officers. I ordered some of the men to go into the house and bring them out. They found a table spread with milk, honey, and all sorts of nice delicacies for a lunch. But no soldiers could be seen, and Mrs. Hanna was too good a Union woman to betray them. Some of the men went upstairs, but by the dim light could see nothing on the floor. Ames opened the door to the garret. He peeped in and called, but it was pitch dark, and no one answered. He thought it would do no harm to fire a shot into the darkness. It had a magical effect. There was a stir and a crash, and instantly a human being was seen descending through the ceiling. He fell on the floor right among the men. The flash of the pistol in his face had caused him to change his position, and in doing so he had stepped on the lathing and fallen through. His descent had been easy and without injury to his person. He was thickly covered with lime dust and mortar. After he was brushed off, we discovered that we had a major. His 3 companions in the dark hole were a captain and 2 lieutenants, who came out through the trap door, and rather enjoyed the laugh we had on the Major. As we left the house, the lunch disappeared with us. It was put there to be eaten. The Major was rather dilatory in mounting. He knew that the relief was due there, and was in hope not only of a rescue, but of turning the tables and taking us with him to his camp. But fate had decreed otherwise. He was admonished of the importance of time to us, and that he must go right on to Richmond, where he had started to go the year before. As soon as possible, John Underwood, with a guard, went on in advance with the prisoners. Just as we left the railroad station, the relief appeared in sight. I remained behind with a dozen men as a rear guard, to keep them back until Underwood had got far ahead. The relief party hung on in sight of me for some distance, but never attacked. After I crossed the horsepen, which almost swam our horses, I started off at a gallop, thinking the pursuit was over. This emboldened the pursuers, and a few came on and crossed after me. I saw that they were divided, and I halted, wheeled, and started back at them. They did not wait for me, but got over the stream as fast as they could. One fellow got a good ducking. I was now master of the situation. I drew up on a hill and invited them to come across, but they declined. I was not molested any more that day. A rather ludicrous thing occurred when we made the attack at the station. There was a so-called Union man there named Mayo Janney. As he lived just on the outskirts of the picket line, he was permitted to conduct a small store and trade with Washington. He had been down to the city and, with other things, had brought out a hogshead of molasses, which he intended to retail to his neighbors at speculative prices. The element of danger in such a trade was, of course, largely considered in estimating the market value of the merchandise. Janney had his store in the vacant railroad depot. He had just knocked out the bung of the barrel of molasses, and was in the act of drawing some to fill the jug of a customer, when he heard the clatter and yell of my men as they rushed down on the terrified pickets. As Herndon Station and the region round about was supposed to be in the exclusive occupation of the Army of the United States, he could not have been more surprised at an earthquake, or if a comet had struck the earth. Forgetting all about the molasses which he had left pouring out of the barrel, he rushed wildly to the door to see what was the matter. He saw the Vermont cavalry flying in every direction in confusion, and whizzing bullets passing unpleasantly close to his ears. Now, to be a martyr in any cause was just the last thing which a man in Fairfax, who had taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, had any idea of being. Janney's idea of supporting the Union was to make some money out of it, and a living for his family, but he did not consider that his oath required him to stay there to be shot, or to help to bury or bind up the wounds of those who might be. His idea of honor was as selfish and material as Sir John Falstaff's. He preferred remaining a live man without it to being a dead one who died with it yesterday, so Janney ran away as fast as his legs could carry him, and, if possible, his molasses ran faster than he did. He did not return for several hours to view the field. When he at last mustered up courage to go back, he found the molasses about shoe-deep all over the floor, but not a drop in the barrel. Now Janney's loyalty to the Union was not altogether above suspicion. It was suspected that he had taken the oath for profit, and probably to enable him to act as a spy for me. The loss of his molasses proved his innocence, but for that fact he would have been arrested and sent to board at the old Capitol on the charge of having given me the information on which I had acted. When I overtook my command at Middleburg, I found Dick Moran, after the style of the ancient bards, in the street, rehearsing the incidents of the day to an admiring crowd. I paroled the privates and let them go home, as I could not then spare a guard to take them back to the Confederate lines, which were at Culpeper. I put the 4 officers on their parole to report at Culpeper to Fitz Lee, and sent with them simply as an escort a Hungarian whom we called Jake. On the way out they spent one night at a farmer's house. Now Jake had been a soldier under Kossuth, and having had some experience in Austrian perfidy, had no sort of confidence in the military value of a parole. When time came for the officers to go to bed, Jake volunteered to take their boots down to the kitchen to be blacked. He had no fears of their leaving, barefooted in the snow, as long as he held on to their boots. Jake told me, with a chuckle, of his stratagem on his return. He never doubted that it kept his prisoners from going away that night. Drainesville, Va., March 24, 1863. Colonel, I have the honor to report on the 17th instant, at 1 p.m., the reserve picket post at Herndon Station, consisting of 20, 5 men, under command of 2nd Lieutenant Alexander G. Watson, Company L, 1st Vermont Cavalry, was surprised by Captain Mosby, with a force of 40. 2 men and 21 of our men, together with Major William Wells, Captain Robert Schofield, Company F, and 2nd Lieut. Alexander G. Watson, Company L, and Pearlie C. J. Cheney, Company C 2nd Lieutenant captured, all of 1st Vermont Cavalry. The 3 first were visiting the post. The surprise was so complete the men made but little or no resistance. The enemy were led on by citizens and entered on foot by a bridle path in rear of the post, capturing the vidette stationed on the road before he was able to give the alarm. Every effort was made, on receipt of the intelligence by me, to capture the party, but without avail. Had 2nd Lieut. Edwin H. Higley, Company K, 1st Vermont Cavalry, who had started with the relief for the post consisting of 40 men. Together with 10 of the old guard who joined him, performed his duty, the whole party could and would have been taken. I cannot too strongly urge that orders may be given that all citizens near outpost must remove beyond the lines. Such occurrences are exceedingly discreditable, but sometimes unavoidable, not only calculated to embolden the enemy, but dispirit our men. I am, Ants, Charles F. Taggart, a Major, commanding post. Colonel R. Butler Price, commanding, and Sac. Near Piedmont, Va, March 18, 1863. General, yesterday I attacked a body of the enemy's cavalry at Herndon Station in Fairfax County, completely routing them. I brought off 25 prisoners, a Major Wells, 1 captain, 2 lieutenants, and 21 men, all their arms, 26 horses and equipments. 1, severely wounded, was left on the ground. The enemy pursued me in force, but were checked by my rear guard and gave up the pursuit. My loss was nothing. The enemy have moved their cavalry from Germantown back of Fairfax Courthouse on the Alexandria Pike. In this affair my officers and men behaved splendidly, and c. Jano S. Mosby, Sapton, Omk, Major, General J. E. B. Stewart. Headquarters Army of Northern Virginia, March 21, 1863, respectfully forwarded for the information of the Department, and as evidence of the merit and continued success of Captain Mosby. R. E. Lee, to General. Chapter 7. 'Tis sweet to win, no matter how, one's laurels, by blood or ink, Don Juan. During the time I had been operating against the outposts of the Union Army in Northern Virginia, I kept up a regular correspondence with Stewart by means of couriers, and reported to him the result of every action. The base from where I operated was on its flank, and so I compelled it to present a double front. The prisoners taken were sometimes released on their paroles, but generally sent out under charge of a guard to the provost marshal at Culpeper Court House. The necessity of making the details for guard duty seriously diminished my effective strength. It would take nearly a week for them to go over and return, and I was often compelled to wait on that account before undertaking an expedition. The men, too, who would join me to go on a raid just to get a horse, would generally quit as soon as it was over to return to their own regiments. When an enterprise had been accomplished, I was often left as forlorn as Montrose after fighting and winning a battle with the undisciplined Highland clans. They had all scattered and gone home with their plunder. I would have to give notice of my place and time of meeting several days in advance, in order to make sure of a sufficient number answering the call to effect any good work. The longer I remained in the country, successful raids became more difficult, as the enemy was all the time on the lookout, and kept every point closely guarded. I had promised Stewart, as an inducement, to let me have some men, either to compel the enemy to contract their lines in Fairfax County or to reinforce them heavily. Having no fixed lines to guard or defined territory to hold, it was always my policy to elude the enemy when they came in search of me and carry the war into their own camps. This was the best way to keep them at home. To have fought my own command daily, on equal terms and in open combats against the thousands that could have been brought against it by the North, would soon have resulted in its entire annihilation. I endeavored to compensate for my limited resources by stratagems, surprises, and night attacks, in which the advantage was generally on my side, notwithstanding the superior numbers we assailed. For this reason, the complaint has often been made against me that I would not fight fair. So an old Austrian general complained that Bonaparte violated all military maxims and traditions by flying about from post to post in Italy, breaking up his cantonments and fighting battles in the winter time. The accusations that have been made against my mode of warfare are about as reasonable. In one sense, the charge that I did not fight fair is true. I fought for success and not for display. There was no man in the Confederate Army who had less of the spirit of knight-errantry in him, or took a more practical view of war than I did. The combat between Richard and Saladin by the Diamond of the Desert is a beautiful picture for the imagination to dwell on, but it isn't war, and was no model for me. The poets have invested the deeds of the Templars with the colors of romance, but if they were half as generous as they were said to have been, it was because their swords, and not their hearts, were dedicated to a cause. I never admired and did not imitate the example of the commander who declined the advantage of the first fire, but, while I conducted war on the theory that the end of it is to secure peace by the destruction of the resources of the enemy, with as small a loss as possible to my own side, there is no authenticated act of mine which is not perfectly in accordance with approved military usage. Grant, Sheridan, and Stonewall Jackson had about the same ideas that I had on the subject of war. I will further add that I was directly under the orders of Stuart up to the time of his death, in May 1864, and after that time of General Robert E. Lee until the end of the war. With both of these two great Christian soldiers I had the most confidential relations. My military conduct received from them not only approbation but many encomiums. In a letter received from Stuart about this, he said, "I heartily wish you great and increasing success in the glorious career on which you have entered." In September 1864 I visited General Lee at his headquarters near Petersburg. I had been badly wounded a week or so before by a bullet, which I still carry in me. When he saw me hobbling up to him on my crutches, he came to meet me and said as he extended his hand, "Colonel, I have never had but one fault to find with you. You are always getting wounded." I mention this circumstance to show that all I did had the sanction of the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, of which my own command, the 43rd Battalion of Virginia Cavalry, was a part. I was independent simply in the sense that both General Lee and General Stuart had such confidence in me that they never undertook to trammel me with orders, but gave me full discretion to act as I chose. After the death of Stuart, General Lee frequently wrote to me, although we were separated by a distance of over 100 miles. All of his letters are in his own handwriting. What were called my depredations had caused another brigade of cavalry to be sent into Fairfax to protect Washington. The frequent incursions we had made down there created great alarm and an apprehension that they might be extended across the Potomac. The deliberations of the Senate were frequently disturbed by the cry that the Gauls were at the gate. One day I rode down on a scout in sight of the dome of the Capitol, when a wagon came along, going to Washington, which was driven by the wife of a Union man who had left his home in Virginia and taken refuge there. I stopped it, and after some conversation with the driver, told her who I was. With a pair of scissors she had, I cut off a lock of my hair and sent it to Mr. Lincoln, with a message that I was coming to get one of his soon. A few days after this, I saw in the Star that it had been delivered to him, and that the President enjoyed the joke. After returning from my last expedition to Herndon Station, I had sent John Underwood down to search along the lines for a weak point where I might make a successful attack. This had now become very difficult to do. There had been so many real and false alarms that the pickets were always on the watch and slept with their eyes open. The vedettes were stationed so close together that it was impossible to pass them without being discovered, and a snowbird could not fly by without being fired at. They had so strengthened their lines that where formerly there had been not over a dozen men, there were now 100. If there was a hole anywhere, I knew that John Underwood would find it. I had about that time received another recruit, who became famous in the annals of my command. His home was in Loudon, and his name was William Hibbs. He was always called the Major, although he never held a commission. He was a blacksmith by trade, over 50 years old, and had already fully discharged the duty he owed to the Southern Confederacy by sending his 2 sons into the army. But for my appearance in the vicinity he would probably have lived and died unheard. The fame of the exploits of my men, and the rich prizes they won, aroused his martial ambition, and he determined to quit the forge and become a warrior bold. The country soon echoed the notes of his fame, as the anvil had once rung with the strokes of his hammer. Around the triumvirate, Dick Moran, John Underwood, and Major Hibbs, recruits now gathered as iron filings cluster around a magnet. They were the germs from which my command grew and spread like a banyan tree. Beatty, who was always my faithful achates, had been captured, but was soon afterward exchanged. Underwood, on his return from his scout, reported a body of about 100 cavalry at Chantilly, which was in supporting distance of several other bodies of about equal numbers. An attack on the post there would be extremely hazardous, on account of the proximity of the others. The chance of success was a poor one, but, as about 50 men had assembled to go with me, I did not like to disappoint them. Each man wanted a horse, as well as a leader to show him how to get one. They were all willing to risk a good deal, and so was I. We started off for Chantilly, down the Little River Turnpike, as the mud prevented our traveling any other route. The advantage of attacking at Chantilly was not only that we had a good road to travel on, but I knew it was the very last place they expected I would attack. They did not look for my approach in broad daylight along the pike, but thought I would come by some crooked path after dark through the pines. I had never asked a commission of the Confederate government, but the warfare I had been conducting had attracted the attention of General Robert E. Lee, who not only complimented me in general orders published to the Army, but at his request the President of the Confederate States sent me a commission as captain, with authority to organize a company of cavalry. This was succeeded, in the course of 2 or 3 weeks, with a commission of major. Before the close of the war I became a full colonel, which was the highest rank I got. My first commission was accompanied by the following letter: Headquarters Army of Northern Virginia, March 23, 1863, Captain J. S. Mosby, through Major General Stewart. Captain, you will perceive from the copy of the order herewith enclosed that the President has appointed you captain of Partisan Rangers. The General commanding directs me to say that it is desired that you proceed at once to organize your company, with the understanding that it is to be placed on a footing with all the troops of the line, and to be mustered unconditionally in the Confederate service for and during the war. Though you are to be its captain, the men will have the privilege of electing the lieutenants so soon as its members reach the legal standard. You will report your progress from time to time, and when the requisite number of men are enrolled, an officer will be designated to muster the company into the service. I am, very respectfully, your obedient servant, W. W. Taylor, an A.G. The Partisan Ranger Law was an act of the Confederate Congress authorizing the President to issue commissions to officers to organize partisan corps. They stood on the same footing with other cavalry organizations in respect to rank and pay, but in addition were given the benefit of the law of maritime prize. There was really no novelty in applying this principle to land forces. England has always done so in Her Majesty's East Indian service, and the spoils of Waterloo were divided among the captors, of which Wellington took his share. The booty of Delhi was the subject of litigation in the English Court of Chancery, and Havelock, Campbell, and Outram returned home from the East loaded with barbaric spoils. As there is a good deal of human nature in people, and as Major Dalgetty is still the type of a class, it will be seen how the peculiar privileges given to my men served to whet their zeal. I have often heard them disputing over the division of the horses before they were captured, and it was no uncommon thing for a man to remind me just as he was about going into a fight that he did not get a horse from the last one. On the Chantilly raid I was accompanied by Captain Hoskins, an English officer who had just reported to me with a letter from Stewart. He had been a captain in the English army and had won the Crimean Medal. After the conclusion of peace he had returned home, but disliking the monotonous life of the barracks, had sold his commission and joined Garibaldi in his Sicilian expedition. He was a thorough soldier of fortune, devoted to the profession of arms, and loved the excitement of danger and the joy of battle. He had been attracted to our shores by the great American War, which offered a field for the display of his courage and the gratification of his military tastes. He was a noble gentleman and a splendid soldier, but his career with me was short. A few weeks after that he fell fighting by my side. I mounted Hoskins and his companion Captain Kennon on captured horses, and they went to try their luck with me. The post at Chantilly was only 2 miles from the camp of a division of cavalry, and flanked by strong supporting parties on each side. When I got within 2 or 3 miles of it, I turned obliquely off to the right, in order to penetrate, if possible, between them and Centerville, and gain their rear. But they were looking out for me, and I found there was no chance for a surprise. I despaired almost of doing anything, but as I did not want to go back without trying to do something, I ordered a few men to chase in the pickets, in hopes that this would draw their main body out for some distance. They did so, and several were killed and captured. From a high position I saw the reserve mount, form, and move up the pike. I regained the pike also, so as not to be cut off. I got ready to charge as soon as they were near, although I did not have half their number, when I discovered another large body of cavalry that had heard the firing, coming rapidly from the direction of Frying Pan to reinforce them. These were more than I had bargained to fight in the open, so I ordered a retreat at a trot up the turnpike. I was certain that they would pursue rapidly, thinking I was running away, and, getting strung out along the pike, would lose their advantage in numbers and give me a chance to turn and strike back. My calculation was right. I kept my men well closed up, with two some distance behind, to give me notice when they got near. I had just passed over a hill, and was descending on the other side when one of my men dashed up and said the enemy was right upon me. I looked back, but they were not in sight. I could distinctly hear their loud cheers and the hoof-strokes of their horses on the hard pike. I had either to suffer a stampede or make a fight. The cavalry officer is like the woman who deliberates. He's lost. If I had gone a step further, my retreat would have degenerated into a rout. My horses were jaded by a long day's march, while the enemy's were fresh. I promptly ordered the men to halt, right about wheel, and draw sabers. It was all done in the twinkling of an eye. Fortunately, just at the place where I halted was an abattis, formed of fallen trees, which had been made by the army the year before. The men formed behind these, as I knew that when they darted out it would create the impression on my pursuers that I had drawn them into an ambuscade. As they stood there, calmly waiting for me to give the word for the onset, a horrid front they form, still as the breeze, but dreadful as the storm. I had no faith in the saber as a weapon. I only made the men draw their sabers to prevent them from wasting their fire before they got to closer quarters. I knew that when they got among them the pistol would be used. My success had been so uninterrupted that the men thought that victory was chained to my standard. Men who go into a fight under the influence of such feelings are next to invincible, and are generally victors before it begins. We had hardly got into position before the head of the pursuing column appeared over the hill, less than 100 yards off. They had expected to see our backs, and not our faces. It was a rule from which during the war I never departed, not to stand still and receive a charge, but always to act on the offensive. This was the maxim of Frederick the Great, and the key to the wonderful successes he won with his cavalry. At the order to charge, my men dashed forward with a yell that startled and stunned those who were foremost in pursuit. I saw them halt, and I knew then that they had lost heart and were beaten. Before they could wheel, my men were among them. Those who were coming up behind them, seeing those in front turn their backs, did the same thing. They had no idea they were running away from the same number of men they had been chasing. My men had returned their sabers to their scabbards, and the death-dealing revolver was now doing its work. The Union cavalry had assumed, as I thought they would, that my retreat had only been feigned to draw them into a trap. They could not understand why I ran away just to run back again. They had no time to ascertain our numbers or to recover from the shock of their surprise in finding us drawn up to receive them. I never witnessed a more complete rout, or one with less cause for it. The chase continued 2 or 3 miles. It was almost dark when we stopped. I remember that in the first set of 4s that led the charge were 3 young men, James W. Poster, Thomas W. Richards, and William L. Hunter, to whom I gave commissions for their gallant conduct. They all have since won honorable positions in civil life. We left the killed and wounded on the field, brought off 36 prisoners and about 50 horses. By strategy and hard fighting, 4 times our numbers had been defeated. The only casualty in my command happened to Major Hibbs, who had his boot heel shot off. He had been one of the foremost leaders in the charge, and like Byron's corsair, everywhere in the thickest of the fight shone his mailed breast and flashed his saber's ray. When the major rode up to me, after the fight was over, he was almost a maniac. He was so wild with delight. And when, in the presence of all the men, I praised his valor, he could no longer contain himself. He laughed and wept by turns. All that he could say in reply was, "Well, Captain, I knew the work had to be done, and that was the way to do it. One thing is certain, the major got a good horse as a reward. The regiment we had fought happened to be the very one to which Ames had belonged, and from which he had deserted a few weeks before to join me. He had gone through their ranks like an avenging angel, shooting right and left. He took a malicious pleasure in introducing some of his old comrades to me. I could not help feeling a pang of regret that such courage as his should be stained with dishonor. It was Hoskins's first fight with me. He said it was better than a fox chase. I recall his image now as it rises above the flood of years, as he hewed his path through the broken ranks. It was a point of honor or of military etiquette with him to use his sword and not his pistol. In this way he lost his life. I reported to Stuart the result of the engagement and received from him the following letter in reply: Headquarters Cavalry Division, Army of Northern Virginia, March 27, 1863. Captain, your telegram announcing your brilliant achievement near Chantilly was duly received and forwarded to General Lee. He exclaimed upon reading it, "Hurrah for Mosby." I wish I had 100 like him. Heartily wishing you continued success, I remain your obedient servant, J.E.B. Stewart, to Major General Commanding, Captain J.S. Mosby, to Commanding, etc. Fairfax Courthouse, March 23, 1863. Sir, at 5 p.m. our picket in front of Chantilly was attacked. The vedettes were on the alert and gave the alarm. The reserve of about 70 men were immediately under arms and charged the enemy, who fled for 2 miles along the Little River Turnpike. Between Saunders Tollgate and Cub Run, there is a strip of woods about a half a mile wide through which the road runs. Within the woods and about a quarter of a mile apart are 2 barricades of fallen trees. Our troops pursued the enemy between these barricades. Behind the latter, some of the enemy were concealed. The head of the column was here stopped by a fire of carbines and pistols, and also by a fire upon the flank from the woods. The column broke and was pursued by the enemy 1.5 miles. It was then rallied by the exertions of Majors Bacon and White. Captains McGuinn and Hasbrook, when they heard of the alarm, proceeded on a gallop from Frying Pan, and joining Major White's command, pursued the enemy for 8 miles. Night coming on, and the enemy being more numerous than we were, and our horses exhausted, the column halted and returned to Chantilly. The line of pickets is now established. Our loss is killed Corporal Giles, Company H, 5th New York Cavalry, James Doyle, Company C, John Harris, Company L, mortally wounded, Sergeant Leahy, Company C. Lieutenant Merritt taken prisoner. Rop Johnstone, Lieutenant Colonel commanding. Colonel R. Butler Price, commanding Cav Brig. Headquarters, Army, Northern Virginia, March 26, 1863. General, on the 25th, 23 instant, Captain Mosby attacked and routed a body of the enemy's cavalry on the Little River Turnpike. Near Chantilly, he reports 10 killed and wounded, and a lieutenant and 35 men, with their horses, arms, and equipments captured. He sustained no loss, etc. R. E. Lee, to General. Fauquier County, VA, April 7, 1863. General, I have the honor to submit the following report of the operations of the cavalry under my command, since rendering my last report. On Monday, March 16th, I proceeded down the Little River Pike to capture 2 outposts of the enemy, each numbering 60 or 70 men. I did not succeed in gaining their rear as I expected, and only captured 4 or 5 vedettes. It being late in the evening, and our horses very much jaded, I concluded to return. I had gone not over a mile back when we saw a large body of the enemy's cavalry, which, according to their own reports, numbered 200 men, rapidly pursuing. I feigned a retreat, desiring to draw them off from their camps. At a point where the enemy had blockaded the road with fallen trees, I formed to receive them, for with my knowledge of the Yankee character, I knew they would imagine themselves fallen into an ambuscade. When they had come within 100 yards of me, I ordered a charge, to which my men responded with a vim that swept everything before them. The Yankees broke when we got in 75 yards of them, and it was more of a chase than a fight for 4 or 5 miles. We killed 5, wounded a considerable number, and brought off 1 lieutenant and 35 men prisoners. I did not have over 50 men with me, some having gone back with the prisoners and others having gone on ahead when we started back, not anticipating any pursuit. On Monday, March 31st, I went down in the direction of Drainesville to capture several strong outposts in the vicinity of that place. On reaching there, I discovered that they had fallen back about 10 miles down the Alexandria Pike. I then returned 6 or 8 miles back and stopped about 10 o'clock at night at a point about 2 miles from the pike. Early the next morning, one of my men, whom I had left over on the Leesburg Pike, came dashing in and announced the rapid approach of the enemy, but he had scarcely given us the information when the enemy appeared a few hundred yards off, coming up at a gallop. At this time our horses were eating. All had their bridles off, and some even their saddles. They were all tied in a barnyard. Throwing open the gate, I ordered a countercharge, to which my men promptly responded. The Yankees, never dreaming of our assuming the offensive, terrified at the yells of the men as they dashed on, they broke and fled in every direction. We drove them in confusion 7 or 8 miles down the pike. We left on the field 9 of them killed, among them a captain and lieutenant, and about 15 too badly wounded for removal. In this lot 2 lieutenants. We brought off 82 prisoners, many of these also wounded. I have since visited the scene of the fight. The enemy sent up a flag of truce for their dead and wounded, but many of them being severely wounded, they established a hospital on the ground. The surgeon who attended them informs me that a great number of those who escaped were wounded. The force of the enemy was 6 companies of the 1st Vermont Cavalry, one of their oldest and best regiments, and the prisoners inform me that they had every available man with them. There were certainly not less than 200, the prisoners say it was more than that. I had about 65 men in this affair. In addition to the prisoners, we took all their arms and about 100 horses and equipments. Privates Hart, Hurst, Keyes, and Davis were wounded. The latter has since died. Both on this and several other occasions they have borne themselves with conspicuous gallantry. In addition to those mentioned above, I desire to place on record the names of several others, whose promptitude and boldness in closing in with the enemy contributed much to the success of the fight. They are Lieutenant Chapman, late of Dixie Artillery, Sergt Hunter and Privates Wellington, and Harry Hatcher, Turner, Wild, Sowers, Ames, and Seibert. There are many others, I have no doubt, deserving of honorable mention, but the above are only those who came under my personal observation. I confess that on this occasion I had not taken sufficient precautions to guard against surprise. It was 10 o'clock at night when I reached the place where the fight came off on the succeeding day. We had ridden through snow and mud upwards of 40 miles, and both men and horses were nearly broken down. Besides, the enemy had fallen back a distance of about 18 miles. John S. Mosby, and Captain Commanding, Major, General J.E.B. Stewart. Headquarters, Cavalry Division, April 11th, 1863. Respectfully forwarded, as in perfect keeping with his other brilliant achievements. Recommended for promotion, J.E.B. Stewart, a Major General. Headquarters, Army, Northern Virginia, April 13th, 1863. Respectfully forwarded for the information of the Department. Telegraphic reports already sent in. R. E. Lee to General. April 22nd, 1863. Adjutant General. Nominate as Major if it has not been previously done. J. A. S. Seddon, Secretary.